Previously, in the creation of Luminous. This knife I'm working on is called Luminous, and it took me 250 hours to make, and in this video we're going to finish it up. First up is a bunch of hand sanding on all the fittings. I need to take them from a belt finish all the way up to a 3000 grit hand rubbed finish. After all the hand sanding's done on the fittings, it's time to buff them up for a nice mirror finish. I'm doing a two-stage buffing process for this. One wheel's turning at 3600 RPM with a slightly coarser compound, and then the other one's turning at 1750 with a super fine compound. My goal with the first buffing wheel is to get rid of all the 3000 grit scratches, and then with the finer compound on the second buffing wheel, I'm getting a nice mirror finish. After spending quite a lot of time buffing the fittings to get them all to a mirror finish, it's time for the process that I both love and hate, gun bluing. I love the finish, but I don't really like the process because it can be a little bit unpredictable at times, and sometimes you have to redo your parts over and over again to get them to come out perfect. Since I'm just gun bluing some fittings, I'm going to use a really small tank that's actually an acetone can with a small amount of bluing salts. No need to get out the big setup for this. One of the most critical parts to getting a good gun blued finish is cleaning the parts thoroughly. So I clean them, double clean them, and triple clean them, make sure they're good. I always feel a little apprehensive when it comes to this part of the knife build. One random variable that I didn't take into account, or a little smudge, could cause the bluing to come out bad, and I'd have to redo it and resand and finish the parts and try again. I add the parts to a container of DuraClean mixed with water, heated up to 180 degrees for the final chemical cleaning. Once the chemical cleaning is done, I take the parts out of the chemical cleaning process after they've been in there for about 5 minutes and rinse them off with cold water. I'm using Brownell's Oxenate 7 heated up to 285 degrees. Once the part has blued for about 10 minutes, I take them out, rinse them off, and add them to a container of water that I've got heated up. We're going to boil these parts to help clean off all the salts, especially on the inside of the parts. We don't want the salts to stay on the insides of the parts because it can actually start to grow to the outside of your handle and cause all sorts of rust and everything. So we get it all cleaned off in boiling water. Now that the parts are done boiling, I rinse them off with clean water once again, and then blow them dry with air. I don't want to rub them down with a paper towel or any kind of cloth or anything, because the bluing can be kind of fragile. You need to give the bluing some time to set up, because I've noticed if you wipe it down too early, it can cause really weird streaks. I'll let the parts sit in some water displacing oil overnight. It's the next day and I've taken the parts out of the oil and cleaned them off thoroughly to do a final inspection and make sure they look good, and they look amazing. I call this my black mirror finish sometimes because it literally looks like a black mirror. It's time to move our attention to the blade. I need to get this blade sanded from 600 grit all the way up to 1500 grit before we can etch the Damascus. The 1500 grit finish leaves the blade pretty shiny. You can see a lot of start and stop marks from the sanding process. I'm not going to mess with sanding those out because those will disappear as we take the blade through its etching process. Just like with the gun bluing, it's important to get the blade really clean before we etch it in ferric chloride. To reveal the pattern in our Damascus blade, I'm using a 4:1 ratio of ferric chloride to water. I let the blade sit in the ferric chloride for a couple of minutes, and then we can take it out and do the first oxide sanding process.
You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Right after taking the blade out of the ferric chloride, I neutralize it in a separate container with baking soda and water in it. And then I spray the blade down and sand on it with 3000 grit paper to remove all the black oxides that the ferric chloride created on the blade. This will help us get a nice, clean, crisp etch. If you don't clean the oxides off, sometimes the blade can end up with an etch that looks kind of dirty. If you inspect it really closely, maybe you'll see in the dark areas a really kind of rough, fuzzy texture. And I want to make it nice and clean and crisp. After going through a few cycles of etching the blade and cleaning off all the black oxides, it's time to coffee darken the blade. I use anywhere between a half and one whole container of Nescafe Bold coffee, and only like a half a gallon of water, so it's highly concentrated. The coffee does etch the blade, but not very much at all compared to the ferric chloride. I could leave this blade in the instant coffee mix overnight with no worries of anything over etching, but if I left the blade in the ferric chloride overnight, the next day my blade would probably be almost gone from etching all the way through. Our coffee mixture is ready to go and cooled down. The blade is clean. I'm gonna go ahead and submerge the blade in the coffee and let it sit for a few hours. After the blade's done soaking in the coffee mixture, I use a sunshine cloth to clean all the 15 and 20. It gets rid of this yellow haze that forms on the 15 and 20 and brightens it back up to a nice silver color. I'm also trying out something new I saw on RPM Neil's YouTube channel, and that is to use a wax to help give the blade a really protective coating and make that coffee darkened finish even more durable. Once the coffee darkening, sunshine cloth, and waxing is finished, the blade looks absolutely gorgeous. The black is really black and all the silver looks nice and silver. Got a high contrast finish. Everything looks nice and shiny too. The sunshine cloth polishes the 15 and 20 in the same way that a buffing wheel would and leaves it extra shiny. In the end, I did end up doing the coffee darkening twice because I had two areas the first time that didn't seem to take well to it, so I had to redo it a second time in order to get a nice 100% coverage. There's one more scary thing that I've been putting off that needs to be done on this knife next, and that's the dog bone style pins in the handle. I'm kind of scared of these because they're going to be challenging to do, and one little mistake could cost a lot of time to undo. So the dog bone bowie style pins have these little tiny domed washers that I've already made, and they've been gun blued with that black mirror finish on them. Traditionally, these washers and the pins going through them would be made out of silver, gold, or maybe nickel silver, something like that. I wanted to do something a little different though, so I made the washers out of steel and gun blued them black. The pins going through the washers will be finished off as close to flush as I can possibly get, and they will be made out of Arginium silver. So you'll have a little tiny silver dot right in the center of the black domed washer, and I think it'll look really cool. It should also tie in well with the over 200 silver dots that are inlaid on the rest of the fittings. Anytime you hear me say silver, I'm actually talking about Argentium silver. Argentium silver has a small amount of germanium in it, and it makes it very corrosion resistant. That way it won't turn gray after just a couple of weeks, and you won't have to polish it like your grandma's silverware. Argentium silver still has a high amount of silver in it though, so it's technically still classified as a sterling silver with over 90% silver content. My process for doing these dog bone style pins begins with cleaning out the hole going through the handle with a drill bit just to make sure there's nothing in there. I then cut off a small piece of silver wire that can go through our hole in the handle. The silver wire I'm using for the pins is a couple thousandths of an inch larger than the holes in the handle. I use a Scotch-Brite wheel to just shave a little bit of material off the pins so they'll fit through the handle holes. Once I'm happy with how the pin fits through the handle, I cover the pin in Starbond CA glue and then put the pin into the handle. I use the CA glue to keep the pin from moving. I'm going to be peening on the ends of the pin, and I don't want it to move back and forward as I do that. Now I bend the ends of the pin sticking out of the handle to match the radius on the sides of the handle. I add the domed blued steel washers. I'm going to leave about 40 or 50 thousandths of an inch of silver sticking out past the blued steel washers. That'll give me enough to dome over on the ends. Before we dome anything, I want to kind of round and clean up the ends of the pins. So I'm just using a handheld drill and a cup burr. You could use a small hammer to smash the ends of the pins, but I decided to use my handpiece for my engraving setup. This gives me a little more control, and I can better focus where I want to smash the pin head. The holes in the domed washers have a little bit of a taper in them, so my goal here is to make the ends of the pin swell out to fill in that taper in the washer, and that's what will hold everything in place. The next series of steps is probably the trickiest part of this entire build, and that's to get these pin heads ground down as flush as I possibly can to the domed washers. And then I cover the ends of the pins with green masking tape and rub it down firmly around the domed washers. We can then take it to the buffing wheel and actually buff through the tape where that little bit of silver pin is still sticking up, and use the buffing wheel to actually buff away the pin material and get it closer to being flush with the washer. This is really tricky though. If I buff a little too much, I'll buff through the masking tape that's protecting the black domed washer and actually ruin the finish on the washer. In the end, the silver isn't perfectly flush with the black washers, but it's so close that it's only a couple thousandths of an inch above the washers. There's only one more thing to do before the final assembly of this entire project, and that is to sharpen the blade. It's no good having a pretty knife if it's not sharp. It's finally the moment of truth. We can assemble the knife. The guard still fits nice and tight, and I have to lightly tap it in place with a hammer and my special guard punch. I cover the tang with a little bit of oil to help protect it. Add the lineup pins into the front spacer and attach that assembly to the handle. And now, hold the blade firmly and pop the handle into place. The final handle piece is our pommel nut, which holds the entire assembly together. I look angry because I'm trying to tighten the pommel nut as much as I can without breaking off the drill bit, which I'm using to tighten it. A final checkup after the final assembly doesn't hurt to make sure that everything fits nice and tight and we don't see any daylight coming through between the handle pieces and the fittings. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you for the first time, Luminous. As I mentioned before, this knife build took over 250 hours to complete. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, I would very much appreciate you subscribing. And if you're subscribing already, then hitting that like button would be amazing. Thank you so much for following along and being part of the journey with me. I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye.